Today, we see if gamers were mind-flayed too much, or was alone time with a bear too enticing to quit. Game of the year, here we come. Let's find out if anyone played Baldur's Gate 3. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I am BD, and this is Did Anyone Play? A series where we investigate, analyze, and determine the truth about how much gamers have actually played a game like Baldur's Gate 3. How do we do this? We use trophy and achievement milestones within games and then compare those results to an ever-growing database to evaluate and rank games compared to the rest of the industry. Using objective data and statistical comparisons, we can draw conclusions. We aren't reviewing the game in a traditional sense. Our goal is to provide analysis that can be better used to understand player preference while ignoring game sales and hype to ensure we see reality as it truly is. Please drop a like or a sub to the channel if you want more of these types of videos. We're just starting out, so anything you can do is very much appreciated, and a quick spoiler warning as we may be talking about some elements of late game progression. So let's find out if anyone actually played Baldur's Gate 3 on Xbox, PS5, and Steam. Remember that all percentages we'll be talking about here come from the total number of players that have actually launched and or played the game, not bought the game, so these results are a full reflection on how gamers played Baldur's Gate 3. The first milestone that players will likely reach is called Descent from a Venus. This milestone is achieved once a player completes the prologue, so how many players made it to this very early milestone for Baldur's Gate 3? On Xbox, 81% of players got to this first milestone. For PS5, 84.9%, and for Steam, it was 91.1%. So let's pause here to evaluate. Baldur's Gate 3 is off to a solid start here. Steam has lost almost 10% of players, which isn't too bad, but PS5 lost 15% and Xbox lost nearly 20%. This seems a bit high, but these results are actually well above the industry average. Here's a quick look in graph form, and I've put the database average up there. All platforms are well above the average. You can see that Steam is clearly leading, but the consoles are also doing pretty well. It's a good start for BG3 and Milestone 1. So what is Baldur's Gate 3? It's a role-playing game that is based on tabletop D&D systems. It was partially released into early access in October of 2020, and player feedback helped improve the game during development. BG3 is both a single and multiplayer experience where the player can create a character and form a party of adventurers to explore the world of the Forgotten Realms. With a high focus on player choice and agency, which routinely creates unexpected story moments, Baldur's Gate 3 works to recreate the tabletop D&D experience. It was developed and published by Larian Studios. Baldur's Gate 3 released for Steam in August of 2023, PS5 in September of 2023, and Xbox in December of 2023. The second milestone all players would likely reach is called the Plot Thickens. This is awarded after a player completes Act 1 of the game. The only requirement for this milestone is that the player leaves for the Shadow-Cursed Lands. So for Steam, 51.9% of players achieve this, PS5 is at 43.9%, and Xbox is at 41%. Seems things have taken a bit of a turn here. Nearly half the players on Steam are gone at this point, and worse yet, almost 60% are gone on Xbox. This is a huge drop, and now all platforms are below average. It seems that Baldur's Gate 3 has a large issue retaining players through the first act after the prologue is complete. It's always good to understand the competition a game was up against when it launched. We will look at the initial release for Steam. What was happening around August 3rd, 2023 in the gaming world? Well, titles like Overwatch 2, Remnant 2, and F1 Manager 2023 came out around this time on the platforms. Looking at Google Trends here, we can see that Baldur's Gate 3 in blue was dominating at the time of release. So hype was huge for BG3, especially after it launched, and I think we can say the competition was above average, but not in the same league. We'd like to pick a mid-game milestone for our third marker. For Baldur's Gate, we chose The City Awaits. This is awarded after a player clears the Shadow-Cursed Lands and completes Act 2. There are more requirements to complete Act 2, so it's a bit more involved for the player. How many players are left at this point in the game? For Xbox, it's 29.1%. On PS5, we have 33.1%, and finally for Steam, 39.2% are left. The loss of players definitely slows a bit here. Steam has moved back above the average. Both Xbox and PS5 are still struggling, but have improved. BG3 lost about 10% of players across platforms from Act 1 to Act 2. How did Baldur's Gate 3 do with critics? Well, Metacritic for PlayStation has it at a 96 out of 100. For Xbox, it was a near perfect 99 out of 100. And for Steam, the reviews show overwhelmingly positive recent and all-time, with over 500,000 reviews. These are extraordinary reviews from every direction. And Baldur's Gate 3 won just about every Game of the Year award there was to give out in 2023. The reception was massively positive for the game overall. The most important milestone is our fourth one. This is for completing the main objective and what we will ultimately base our final score on. It definitely shows how many players finished the game and truly played Baldur's Gate 3. This milestone is called Allswell that ends well, and is awarded for completing the third and final act no matter what path the player chooses. Where does Baldur's Gate 3 end up on the different platforms? On Xbox, 12.8% of players completed the game. For Steam, it was 20.5%, and for PS5, 16.9% of players finished this milestone. Let's pause here since we've reached the end of the game. We want to check the percentage of players that quit each platform after making it through the first milestone, but failing to reach game completion. Here, all platforms are doing worse than the database average. Xbox is the worst and Steam performs the best, but there's a lot of player loss, and much more than you would expect from a AAA Game of the Year juggernaut like this. Finally, to get a feel for how the completion is treated this game, the rare milestone 5 chosen for Baldur's Gate 3 is called Busker. This milestone can be achieved if the player can earn a total of 100 gold from playing music for an audience. For Xbox, we see that 0.8% of players reach this milestone. For PS5, it's 1.1%, and for Steam, 1.7% of players did it. Now let's see the full picture. Here are the raw milestones for our platforms for Baldur's Gate 3, and we have also added the database average for each milestone in gray for comparison purposes. Let's get into it. For BG3, we do see a very strong initial result at milestone 1. Steam starts out very strong, and PS5 and Xbox are not too far behind. But as we progress to milestone 2, we see all platforms fall dramatically. BG3 was shedding players in Act 1 at an alarming rate, but that trend corrects, and most players that remained after Act 1 went on to complete Act 2. The completion of the game dips below the industry average on all platforms, but throughout all milestones from start to finish, Steam was clearly the strongest platform for Baldur's Gate 3. So this is our final tally for our milestones, but now let's see how the game stacks up against all other games in our database, and find out if anyone truly played Baldur's Gate 3. We use Milestone 4 as our ultimate ranking target. Here are the results for each platform for Milestone 4 once again. It's time to reveal the final rank Baldur's Gate 3 has in our database. Here we go. Steam is a 5 out of 10, Xbox is a 2 out of 10, and PlayStation is a 4 out of 10. An average number of gamers played BG3 on Steam. PlayStation had a lower than average result, and Xbox had very few gamers actually play it on that platform. This is a particularly underwhelming result for a game with so much hype and so many accolades. The player retention was just not there for such a story-heavy game. So those are the scores, but let's see if we can tease out some other observations by looking at the results in different ways. It's time for the deep dive. Let's start with progressive player loss. Each milestone shows how many total players have stopped playing the game at that particular point. Here we can see the initial strong retention results for Milestone 1, but then the huge increase in losses to complete Milestone 2. The losses slow down a bit after that. Steam remains the strongest platform for BG3, while Xbox is the weakest. Moving on, we can look at milestone player retention. This calculation only takes into account the player population loss as a percentage compared to the previous milestone. This illustrates the large loss of players at both Milestone 2, but again at Milestone 4. These are two very large stop moments for Baldur's Gate 3. How about completionists? How did the rarest milestones shake out in the different platforms? Here we see Steam takes nearly 48% of the results, with PlayStation at 31% and Xbox taking up the rest at 21%. These are pretty balanced results and align well with our other findings. Finally, we check on early versus late game retention. When you read a chart like this, the best performers are further away from the center of the circle. Early game, Steam is outperforming the other platforms decently. For the end game, we actually see that the PS5 catches up to Steam, with Xbox still trailing. Finally, for completionists, we see a much closer result, with the order of platforms still unchanged. Let's take one final look at all the platforms and their Milestone 4 results, but this time we show you the full percent rank within our database. This is to give you a detailed view of how the rankings played out. Use this data as you will. Let's wrap this up. So what are our major takeaways from all the data? Baldur's Gate 3 did not have the showing I would have expected. The game clearly struggled to retain players at different points. Steam was the brightest spot, but that only amounted to hitting the industry average. Both consoles were below the average, and Xbox was downright sad, only ranking a 2 on our scale. Clearly, based on the data we have, there were two major areas, that being Act 1 and Act 3. The prologue got gamers interested, but Act 1 saw huge losses. This could be that players pulled into getting Baldur's Gate 3 because of the hype and awards, found out it wasn't the game style they were particularly interested in, and quit in those early stages. It could also be that Act 1 is large and players got lost in it but never quite moved on to the next act. That would explain Act 1, but the losses for Act 3 are even more distressing, as that means gamers that were already committed to the game never found their way to the end of the story. But there is another possibility that because you can do just about anything in the game, players found themselves in states where getting to the end of the game wasn't as viable, and so many of them needed additional playthroughs to experience the proper story end. Also, is Act 3 just worse in perspective to the rest of the game, and that might cause players to quit at the rate they did. A game of this stature that just won about every end of the year award you could imagine in the gaming industry doesn't have a great showing in our results. I think that's a sign that sometimes awards and hype and player expectation can get a little out of control. Baldur's Gate 3 is a great gaming accomplishment, but anything that reviews that strong should be able to retain players and keep them engaged. And in fact, we see very little evidence of that in the numbers. However, one strong point we should keep in mind is that BG3's release was staggered on the platforms. There was a 1-month delay before it hit PS5 after Steam. Then 3 months after PlayStation, it arrived on Xbox. But even with that staggered release, we see similar results and curves across all platforms, so that's definitely a positive result. Baldur's Gate 3 is a tale of two games. One game is reviewed by critics and gamers as an exceptional and amazing experience worthy of all the awards given to it. The other game is one that connects with an average number of gamers or less, and loses them at different key moments in the story. It is clear Larian has an incredible amount of love for the source material and did as much as they could to bring this world to life, and by all accounts they did an exceptional job. But somewhere along the line, a significant amount of gamers found themselves leaving and not returning to the world Larian created. It's possible that the game style itself could have been an early turnoff with gamers that got caught up in the hype and purchased a game where they weren't the target audience. But we can also see that later in the game there were struggles as well, and perhaps the polish of the early part of Baldur's Gate 3 masked more issues in the later parts of the experience. That being said, there is no doubt that BG3 was a critical and commercial success. I just wish it had also been a success with gamers compared to the rest of the industry. It should be expected from a Game of the Year winner. Hopefully, this data can help inform better outcomes in the future, and developers can take this feedback into their newer projects to improve on where others found some struggles. And that's a wrap. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to do all the YouTube support stuff. I'd love to read any comments you have down below. What conclusions did you all take from this data? And of course, feel free to suggest the next game we should look at to determine if anyone played it. Until then, take care of yourself and each other.